Why did Media Watch start?
They'd had the idea in the ABC for a long time for a Media Watch program, and they'd done a lot of pilots, I'm given to understand, but I've never seen any of them, and I didn't see them at the time I was asked to have a stab at it. And I think the whole idea really was to balance up some of the print criticism of the ABC by having the ABC look at print. I think that was the motivation. It wasn't what I did or wanted to do, so I didn't do it.
So, what was, in your eyes, the role of Media Watch, and how successful was it?
Well, I thought the role of Media Watch was to represent the consumers, the informed consumers' point of view in respect of the standards of journalism. In other words, Media Watch's real task was to inform the consumers about when they were being lied to, when they were being misled, and when the standards of what they were watching were less than they should have been.
Now, can I take you to one story? ABC reporter John Lombard was outside the Russian parliament.
When the ABC, in every state, did its news program, I think it was a Saturday night, and each of the newsreaders pretended to be asking the questions of the reporter in Moscow. That seemed to me to be a total deception of the audience, and exactly what it was that we would not forgive if it were done by a commercial network. So we certainly weren't going to forgive it when it was done by the ABC. It's that sort of trickery that particularly television journalism is too much prone to. It's too easy to do. You know, the old thing of, I asked the president what he thought about this, one says in the studio, and then you get this grainy old bit of film put in afterwards. Who does that fool except the viewers?
Why is it important that Media Watch not only criticises commercial networks and radio and newspapers, but the ABC? Why is that vital?
It's absolutely vital that Media Watch looks very hard at the ABC because, for a start, Media Watch would have no credibility otherwise. The ABC would have no credibility otherwise. Really, you've got to look at the ABC in total isolation from commercial channels. It ought to be offering an alternative to them, but it ought to be a superior alternative. That's why it deserves the closest of the scrutiny of all.
Now to one of your favourites, the Illawarra Mercury. Why did the Illawarra Mercury feature so much in Media Watch?
There's an old show business rule that you've got to have a running gag. And when we started Media Watch, quite a few times in the first few weeks, some stupidity from the Illawarra Mercury thrust itself forward. So it wasn't very hard from there to make the Illawarra Mercury a running gag. I remember Roy and HG were asked whether David Hill's experiment in Asian broadcasting of ABC programs, including Media Watch, had been a good idea. And Roy said, well, it's made the Illawarra Mercury a household name in Singapore.
What's the point of showing spelling errors and grammatical errors in a paper like the Illawarra Mercury? Why is that significant?
If one were to go to a surgeon who could not make an incision in the right place or put the stitches in a way that they weren't going to pull out, you would reject that as incompetence. When you hear a journalist when you read a journalist misspell, make fundamental errors of grammar, mispronounce, and make, in spoken English, fundamental errors, they are proving their incompetence. If they're incompetent at expression in the English language, they're also going to be incompetent at getting the facts right.
Now, in one episode, you revealed that newspaper journalists were regarded on the bottom of the pile in terms of respect. And this came from, I think, a Time survey. Why do you think newspaper journalists were held in such low esteem?
There have been many surveys of the estimation that the public has for various trades, professions and occupations. Journalism, of course, is not a profession. And it always rates very low on the scheme. And that's because I think of the old cliche that you cannot believe what you read. Now, if that be the case, and the public seem to say in these surveys that it is the case, then the reason for it is that people don't believe what they read. I think plagiarism remains a big problem in Australian journalism now, but if you go back 20 years to when we first started noting and exposing some important examples of plagiarism, what we were doing was saying something really that people were not aware of. The real point about exposing plagiarism is to tell the consumers that they have been tricked, that this isn't this person's work at all, it's being put in this newspaper with this person's byline, but you can't trust that. So if you can't trust the truth of what is being asserted about the story, then you can't trust the truth of the story.
Now, just to another issue of plagiarism, can you talk about Alan Jones and how he lifted a passage from a Frederick Forsyth novel?
Some of the best stories we got straight from viewers. And one Monday morning we were telephoned by a dentist from somewhere in the suburbs who said, look, I've just read this column of Alan Jones in the Sunday newspaper. It so happened I was reading a Frederick Forsyth book. At the same time, I put the book down and I picked up the Jones column, and I recognised that what Jones was holding out to be some secret Soviet report about the Gulf War was actually a memorandum that had been fictionalised by Freddie Forsyth and run in the book. But Jones had held it out as some exclusive intelligence he'd been given.
What happened to Alan Jones after Media Watch exposed that incident?
After that plagiarism by Jones, or that lie by Jones, was exposed, the journalists on that particular Sunday newspaper jacked up and said they wouldn't work with him. So it was terrible. Mr. Jones had to go and work for the other Sunday newspaper, whose standards obviously were not quite so high.
Just on the Herald, Media Watch the Herald ran a very emotional story on deer hunting in the national park, and Media Watch revealed that in fact they needed to cull the deers to preserve them.
It's a terrible mistake when a journalist pushes his own barrow, and it was important that what Media Watch did in this particular case was expose the fact that the journalist who was doing the bleeding heart thing about the poor deer in the park was actually motivated by a wish that the deer should remain in the park so that he and his mates could shoot them. And that was, to my mind, one of the starkest examples you've got of journalists not pushing personal interests, or why journalists shouldn't push personal interests and conceal what motivates them. The story wasn't legitimate because it was dishonest. What the journalist did was conceal his own motivation. He wanted deer to remain in the national park so that he and his mates could shoot them, not for any reasons of the little Bambis.
Now, I don't know if you recall this, but this is one of David Salter's favourite stories from the Herald Sun in Melbourne about single mothers. Apparently they ran a story about some mothers that had many, many children.
Yeah. The worst tendency, I think, of many tabloid journalists is to pick the soft target in the belief that the people can never fight back, because it's true. If you want to pillory people, you're not going to do it to the ones who are articulate and have resources. You're going to pick the poorest, the weakest people in the community, the dull bludgers, the mothers on supporting mother benefit. Those are such easy targets, and it comes as such a shock to the journalists when there is something like Media Watch which can fight on behalf of those people.
Okay. Now to Barcelona tonight. In a nutshell, what was that Media Watch program about?
We got a call out of the blue, as not infrequently happened, in fact from a barrister colleague of mine, who said, look, I've just been watching this program on Channel 7, which is supposed to show that the police in Mallorca are corrupt and are protecting Christopher Skase from us getting close to him. And film was shown of police erecting barricades. And the barrister said, I used to live in Barcelona, I go there frequently. That film was in Barcelona, not Mallorca, and that was just the afternoon peak hour that they were arranging the traffic for. It was never a wish of ours to take scalps. We didn't want to see journalists necessarily lose their jobs, except this. What sanction is there? What accountability is there for this dishonesty of journalism? That's the worst crime of all, dishonesty in journalism terms. If there is to be no sanction, and you see the people who lie in things like Barcelona tonight, deceive 1 million people. for their own ends, but nothing ever happens. Oh, sure, they take them off air for a while, but given 6 months, they're back as if nothing happened. So, yes, there should be some kind of penalty, but if they weren't for Media Watch, there'd be nothing.
Now, you mentioned the barrister that gave you the tip-off. How did other Media Watch stories come to the program? Were they the results of tip-offs from people in the industry, the public? Can you talk generally about how those programs came about?
Well, Media Watch set out every week to look at the news of the past week. We didn't so much depend on tip-offs from the public. We got them. I suppose there were some people who rang us in secret from particular media who wanted to have exposed people who were doing things that they didn't approve of. But there was never any sort of organised idea. It was quite startling how much the public would ring up with a concern about something they'd read or seen. More than anything else, the concerns of the public were what drove it. See, what journalists never understood was they thought Media Watch was for them. It wasn't for them, it was about them, and it was for the public. I started in journalism in 1961. It's a very long time ago. And I've never really lost interest in journalism and storytelling and the whole idea of making people aware of things that the media think they should be made aware of. Over all those years, and it's a very long time, my opinion of journalists has declined constantly, and now that I'm a lawyer who looks at journalism from a legal perspective and from the perspective of the rights of people, I couldn't have a lower opinion of journalists in this country than I do. I think there's been an appalling decline, and I think it's all because of lack of accountability. The only accountability is the law of libel and perhaps Media Watch. One of the worst aspects of contemporary Australian journalism is its tendency to bullying. It's very easy to follow the great Australian tradition of kicking a man when he's down. And people like the Paxtons, people with really no strength in the community, no voice in the community, are thought to be absolutely ideal victims. There is really nothing to stop the media kicking them to death, misrepresenting them, lying about them, defaming them, because they know those people are powerless. So it is very important that some power is given to the powerless.
Okay, now to the Steve Barrett story.
There was a long tradition in the yellow press of turning up at the home of a victim of a fatality and saying to the widow at the front door, "Your husband's won a safety award, have you got a photograph of him?" Because the most important thing was to have a photograph. That's a well-known technique of yellow journalism. Seemed to me that was another example. That's what they used to do. It was well known in the Sun and the Mirror when I was a cadet that that's how they got photographs. They always had a photograph of the victim.
Is it the case that many journalists don't consider the welfare of the people they're interviewing?
I think very few journalists consider the welfare of the people they're interviewing and the consequences of writing the story. I am of the view that journalists would sell their own mothers for a story on the front page.
Yeah. All right. Look, just what was the hypocrisy of that Sydney Morning Herald story?
Here you had this story about Bambi and how terrible it was that the authorities were going to cull Bambi and take Bambi out of the park. Trouble is, the story didn't have much weight or persuasiveness once it became known that the person writing the story was a very keen shooter of Bambis and had indeed a conviction for shooting Bambis in a national park.
Terrific. Now, look, last question. A critic of yours over the years was Richard Ackland. He went on to become your successor. Can you talk about that and what you think about it?
I don't know him. I've never taken any notice of him. I don't know what criticisms he's made of me.
Last question, you may not have anything to add as well, but What would you like to see in a 20th anniversary program? What do you think is really important?
I think in a sense it's not a good idea for Media Watch to go any further, because the media know what their accountability is. It's not all that tough. And they probably now like to have Media Watch there because it's a kind of valve that lets off the pressure and never really does anything very serious to them. Never did. Never did. Not even in its strongest days. I think it would be a good idea to do something else, something of a totally different character.